Welcome to the Occult Rejects. In this episode, you got myself, JJ Vance, and Jin the Ninja. Today, we will be talking about the DeLaurence Company. Me and Jin and a few other people have been kind of getting into West Indian magic, and this topic fits in there in a weird way. And I wanted to have Jin come on and talk about it. And it's a topic that I really don't know anything about, so this is really interesting to me. And I got JJ Vance co-hosting with me. So JJ, before we get to start, the show going, and before we introduce Jin, let everybody know what your deal is, in case there's any new listeners who don't know who you are. Let them know where they can find all your stuff, please.
Appreciate the invite, Nick. JJ Vance, host of Operation GCD, and Fridays with the Occult Rejects every Friday night, YouTube, Rumble, and Twixter. And Jen, looking forward to the conversation. I'm going to go with Nick on that. I also don't know much about the subject. However, I'm looking forward to hearing about it. And I appreciate y'all inviting me as the Chicago correspondent in the conversation. My least favorite city. Spent a lot of time there. The politics are dirtier than D.C. And the shenanigans are deep there in that city.
Dirtier than D.C. That's rough. The funny thing is that when he mentioned Chicago, that was even one of the reasons why I even asked you to jump on. I was like, he might know some random thing that might fit into this. You never know, because I do know you do know some stuff about Chicago. And
done a lot of business there.
Yeah, so thank you very much.
Back.
I'm sure you know. That's how I feel about DC.
Right. Done a lot of business there too. Also, don't care to go back.
But thank you very much for jumping on, especially on such a short notice. I appreciate it, man.
Now looking forward to it.
Yes, and finally to the main event, the main guest, Jin the Ninja. I'm sure everybody already knows who he is, but in case you are a new listener and you're not sure, Jin, please let everybody know what your deal is and let them know where they can find your amazing work as well, sir.
Sure. So thank you guys both for having me on, and Nick especially. Well, not especially, but especially for asking me to be like a homie that can, do a whole episode like kind of as a guest. And thank you, obviously, JJ. Every time we work together, it's always like super. We have a really good I don't know. We just it's easy. So you can find me. Sorry.
Yeah, JJ, for sure. I second that, Jen. I always enjoy the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so you can find me, Threshold Saints. An episode just dropped today on Don, which is a anime that's kind of taken Twitter by storm. I'm often on Twitter at Wukong Reborn, WUKONG Reborn, and I do behave. I promise. I've reformed. So. Most of the time I'll just post interesting metaphysical things in interesting ways is what I sort of seek to do. So follow me on there or IG, and I do have a link tree that desperately needs updating, so that will happen this week.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And I'm pretty sure your links are in there already. So everybody go check this stuff out in case you haven't. And now the DeLaurence Company. Jens, I mean, since it's your topic, please take us away and let us know what made you even come across this.
So when we did the episode on West Indian Magic or Obeah, I actually had already done. It wasn't really related to the episode that we did at all, but I did an episode on the reggae sound systems, which were these kind of like the mixtape culture that emerged in reggae in the 70s and the 80s, and how a lot of the people were occultists. And they were consciously playing with the frequencies, the way the sounds and the words and the sort of they would like have different weird sounds as like pots and pans and certain like frequencies and crystals, and they would install them on the street. So like if you're thinking like Crowley, he would have like those street battles between magicians. So they kind of did do this, but they had like huge speakers and they would kind of battle it out in Jamaica with these kind of like rapping MCs or these singing MCs, and they would do it like to the reggae sound system. So basically I looked at like how Obeah was exactly dub. Exactly. So they would use the things, and then the people would also know Obeah, would also know magic. So they would kind of have magical battles in the street, and it was like the music or the sound was a big part of it. And so you can't really discuss Jamaican magic without discussing science. So anyone who is familiar with Nick's amazing series on the grimoires will know that wisdom science is the more common word or wisdom literature as a broader category. People didn't used to think of it as like occultism. It used to be just part of natural sciences, natural philosophy, and it used to be considered wisdom literature. Doesn't mean that you do everything in it. Doesn't mean you read Picatrix and you do everything in it. It's just wisdom literature. It's just meant to expand your sort of knowledge of the universe. So to sort of bring it back to DeLaurence Company was founded in 1901. Now I'm going to get back to this date in a minute because I know Nick, I could see the spark happening. 1901, it's an 11, right? That's an interesting founding date. But so it was founded by W.L. DeLaurence, or L.W., excuse me, L.W. DeLaurence, who was a German American, and he was an occultist. He was a serious occultist. He was involved in multiple like fraternal orders and like probably all the a lot of the, I'm sure JJ will have something to say about this, but in that time of Chicago was like an Art Deco kind of like, or a little bit pre Art Deco paradise, kind of a gangster's paradise as well. So I think that there was a lot of Egyptian kind of influence. Like that's also what he got famous for. Was he published in 1898, so a little bit, but even before the founding of his company, he published a book called The Great Eastern Rite and of Hindu Magic, which is now also called the Obeah Bible, which is the picture that I sent you, Nick, the blue book.
Yes, I'll pull that up now, actually.
And so he published that in 1898. And although says it is Hindu in nature, it's actually not. There's actually really no West Indian, like there's no Indian magic per se. Now, are there comparable ideas between Tantra and Western Hermeticism? Absolutely. So, the Great Book and Magical Art, Hindu Magic, and Indian Occultism. Now, this book is original. Now, there is sort of an internet or maybe an occult rumor in the greater occult community that he directly one to one copied Agrippa's books of occult philosophy 1 through 3, as well as Francis Barrett's The Magus, which is an essay, but also like it's sometimes considered the fourth book of Agrippa, and he just sort of remixed it and put it into this book. Now, sorry, Nick, go ahead.
That is funny. Now, you would have to hope that like your students never look any farther than your work. That's a ballsy move.
Well, it is the rumor. So if you look at the Magus 1 to some of the essays that he published or that he wrote, supposedly, it does seem quite different. Now, are there ideas and certain like the sort of like okay, so in the Magus they talk about the mage as the person who walks out into the crossroads, like specifically calls it like the 4 quadrants of the world, and they themselves are the 5th pillar or the middle pillar. So they are the axis, the plus ultra, that is the ruler of heaven and earth. Now his book also discusses this idea. Now, this idea is also found in sort of West Indian African magic and also Tantra. But I actually think that instead of looking at it as he necessarily borrowed it 1 to 1, maybe this is just a perennial sort of concept, like a cosmological construction of the world of the 10 directions. I know I said there's 4 directions, but really there's the up and down. So that's 2 directions right there. But then you also have the, northwest, northeast, southeast, and southwest. So that's really 10 directions. So you have this kind of cosmological idea that kind of resonates throughout culture, throughout the world. It's kind of it's not fixed in time, it's not fixed in space, it kind of just transcends that. So this is a picture of him. You can see he was said to be like high ranking, I don't know, he said he was like the Brotherhood of Luxor or something like that. Like it's all like Egyptian shit that I don't know about. Yeah, that's what he said. But all of these guys. So there's this idea of the snake oil salesman, which I know JJ will have something to say too about. I think partly it's like mythology that's built around them much later on. I think in their time they actually were looked at like great occultists, which I'll get into later, because definitely people in Jamaica really feared him and thought of him, interestingly, as their guru.
Did he make any claims of being? Has he ever been to Egypt? Supposedly.
So I don't remember if he specifically claimed to have been to Egypt, but he specifically claimed that he was visited by a secret chief. He was a high ranking order in the American Catholic Church, which sounds like, oh, American Catholic Church, that sounds like really normy. But it was a spiritualist church. It's a church of the archangels, really, to receive direct revelation from the four archangels and from Mary, or from God. So
it's interesting how like the reason why I asked is because Dwight York, I know how like I think made claims of like going to Egypt and like had some like he just like referred back to Egyptian stuff too, and he was like a sneak oil salesman, I think. So like
we were even talking about this pre-recording. There's like the hoodoo current in American, even in like, people like to say, oh, it's like this like syncretic slave religion. No, it definitely permeated to the very top of occultism. You can see everybody kind of drawing from it. A mail order hoodoo thing was very popular. It made many black millionaires during this time, exactly this time. It was very popular in the South. It was very popular among white people as well. It's like it transcended race to a high degree.
No, I don't know why it is, but even when I was like in the magical community, kind of like when I was like active in the OTO and other things, people that made money selling stuff like that, the hoodoo and voodoo shit sold like crazy.
Yes, it's $1 billion industry.
Tons. I mean, you can go on Etsy or eBay and find like the silliest spells done through hoodoo and voodoo, and like, I'm sure most of them are scams. Like, I'm sure you're getting something, but
no, it's a lot of scams.
Yeah.
And so that's part of mail order. That's
I
part
think
of like,
even the spell itself is probably not even like, it's probably a scam all around. I hate to say it.
Like, this is the thing. Hoodoo is meant to be like, even if you're not like a magician, it's the system is the idea is that you're supposed to go to the Botanica or go to the mail order or go to whomever, and you get like, maybe the shop owner helps you. Maybe the shop owner is kind of like a sorcerer or spiritualist, and so they help you choose the specific ingredients that you'll need to accomplish your will or your work. So it's supposed to be meant for you. It's not really meant for you to pay money to some card reader so they light candles for you. Sure, can you amend your stuff with that if you can go in person? Now it's become like a large internet business, and like, I'm not trying to block anyone's like coin or whatever, but it does seem to largely be very fraught, we will say, and just probably a little less legitimate than it should be. It just seems to be like something that is both fraud and real, like a lot of magic, actually.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. That's what I was trying to get at, really. Yeah, it just seems like it's it almost seems like something that's just like a known go-to if you just want to try to make a quick buck in that type of field, in my opinion. I don't know.
Because you don't need to be like particularly knowledgeable about ritual magic. You don't need to be particularly knowledgeable about Kabbalah. You don't need to be particularly knowledgeable about anything, in fact, because it's a very practical magic. It's actually not a cosmological system. That sort of speaks back to the other point, is like how it's a very American sort of like, it's a mixture. It has like Jewish Psalm magic, which is Kabbalah, but it's practical Kabbalah. And then it has like books like this that we're looking at right now, and it has obviously colors and herbs and roots and like little tricks to like do things, like to employ the little packets that you can make, or the like little curses that you can do. But it's not a sophisticated, broader system that really looks like, asks big questions of the world. So it's perfect for anyone who already has a working system to then sort of like learn about and then be like, oh, I'm going to apply these more higher order kind of concepts to it, and we'll really like, we'll see what we can do with it. I don't know.
I got a question for you, Jen.
Sure, go for it, JJ.
This all sounds very interesting. How was this marketed? Was this kind of an offshoot that America? I was listening to y'all when I was clearing off my Starlink from the snowdrift. The it sounds like this American Catholic Church that old boy was a part of. Was this like some sort of offshoot of that, or was this marketed
So,
through that? Like how why were folks drawn to this mail order magic system?
well, he had infamy as an occultist for writing this book initially. So that was sort of his claim to fame. Then he went to the US Patent Office in Chicago and he looked at what patents had run out on what occult properties that he had wanted. And so he saw that there was a huge, well, I mean, as I said, it was a huge time for mail order. Like if you were an occultist, this is how you got it. There was no, there was nothing else. This is what it was. It was mail order, kind of sketchy, and even interstate mail order in a lot of the southern states was illegal. You can find this a lot in South Carolina and Georgia and Alabama. They would arrest people for doing mail order hoodoo. So
Really?
yeah, it kind of was a
That was
scam.
illegal, huh?
So you cannot sell magical services across state lines in
That's
some of
ridiculous.
those states. It's very weird. And so even if you were caught sending roots, specific roots like ginseng
Sure.
grows in the south, or like, but they use that a lot in hoodoo, right? Or like a John root, a high John root. If you were sending those, you could be accused of practicing crossing state lines with magic. So that's kind of
That's
how the
wild.
sheriffs would do it. So it is interesting in the Jamaican context, just looking, because I mentioned this name the last time when we were with our guest, is that Duddy Bookman was actually Jamaican, but he was actually originally from Trinidad, but his parents were both Jamaican. So his dad was a Jamaican, like mestizo, kind of like half black, half British kind of guy, who was like high class, and then his mom was half indigenous, half African. Well, not African, but she was like from Jamaica or from Trinidad, and that's who sort of initiated the slave riots. So you have to sort of like look at that when that was. Okay, that's in the very, very late 1790s. I think if we're looking at it from like a broad history of like Caribbean magic, I think it's unquestionable that they were getting a hold of some of these French grimoires, like the Sixth and Seventh Book of Moses, like well, not Long Lost Friend, because that would have been in Dutch and German, but that was actually being translated into English at the same time and was a hugely popular book. It sold millions and millions of copies in America. And so he also jumped on that bandwagon where he was like, we are going to start printing what is John George Homan. So it's called Powwow Secret, the Long Lost Friend. So this is considered to be a book of Dutch powwow magic. I was going to say music, but it's not really music; it's magic. But it was not called powwow originally. It was actually just called Dutch Secrets of Dutch Magic. So they also used the Book of Moses. So he was definitely drawing from a northeastern, but maybe also southeastern sort of strain of American magic. So there's something very American about all
So
this. Like,
That Dutch magic was kind of big up there, like Pennsylvania
yes.
area and stuff. Like, I mean, I'm sure not everybody puts them there on purpose. But like, I even remember like going to certain areas where you would see those. You know how like they have I forgot the specific names of them, but they have those sigils that they use that almost look like a mandala.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's from there.
Back in the day, they used to hang those up on top of the front of their houses to actually advertise that they're into that shit. And that thing has become such a decorative piece that I don't even know that you'll see that on so many fucking houses in certain areas of like Pennsylvania and the United States. It's like, do you even know why that's there? Like, or is it actually that common? But like, you will see that a lot. Those things.
So
And from what I know about it, back in the day, they used to hang them up and put them like on their garage door or on top of their peak of their house. So the ones, it was like a calling card.
no, you're totally right, Nick, and thank you for bringing this up. This is obviously from the Long Lost Friend or Dutch Powwow. So this is obviously Hebrew letters. made in like a jumble. It's probably like a spirit trap is kind of what I'm thinking. I don't know, that might be wrong. But it is something. So you could say it's like for luck or for something else, but it's so maybe they arranged the Hebrew letters in a specific kind of mathematical book of Moses. So it's those in a specific way. So I don't know which one this is. The only ones that I'm actually familiar with a couple of them specifically, but there's a lot of them in this book. So this is a book of pseudo Solomon, and Nick wants to cover it, so we probably will cover it eventually. And so, yeah, I'll save some things. But this is a really important book for West Indian magic because this is kind of like, Nick, you covered like the Nuwabians and like Brother Panic, and like I've done that on my show, like an episode about that. Not necessarily the cult implications, but just how influential he's been on Black American folk magic, and just like the sort of like the magic of the numbers, science of the numbers. I mean, that's also interesting too, talking about wisdom science. Like the Black American people still call it the science of the numbers. So this is something that I didn't well define in the last episode, which is totally on me. But there is a difference between like science, Obeah, and meow, which is healing. So I did talk about it a little bit, but there is a really important distinction. Science is the text. So everything that mostly is science either comes from physical texts like the Bible, comes from hoodoo, or not hoodoo, excuse me, comes from the Bible, comes from Tantra, so actual text, which we talked a little bit about, like this whole like Indian diaspora in the West Indies, and or it comes from books like the I Ching or the Quran. It depends on what island and what composition the people are from, obviously. But though anything that is a text is science. But usually you cannot say you are a scientist. So that's also interesting, is that they would call themselves scientists if they were only book learned, meaning if they had undergone the sort of ritual component of receiving the DeLaurence, specifically the DeLaurence Company books, you would have to receive them, fully undergo the initiation, in which a goetic spirit would maybe throw rocks on your house in the middle of the night, or appear before you, or stand on your chest. And this would happen for 9 nights.
That
And
doesn't sound fun.
so, no, it sounds very creepy. But so they would say that if you got too scared and you sent the books back, then as out of respect, you would lose your refund. So that is also interesting just from a commerce perspective because it is kind of a scam in a way. It's because even the fear, just putting the fear, like saying, oh, like Johnny from whatever town, like he got haunted by the for the books. So then it spreads around, and people don't know. If people are very superstitious, they just don't know. So they all kind of believe it, and so they all end up with these books that are like have this reputation of like being very evil. Now, were they very evil? Probably they're not. They're pretty tame by modern occult standards, to be honest. Like a lot of older grimoires are relatively tame by our standards now. And so, but they do have transgressive ideas if you were growing up in like a very conservative, like Anglican or Catholic island. Yes, I mean the ideas of like practicing like ritual magic with angels and demons and using the names of the prophets to call them down or writing sigils. But they didn't just do that. They actually, even the scientists, the people that wouldn't say that they were practicing Obeah, they would incorporate, Nick even was talking about this, which I thought was really interesting before, is that they incorporated local herbs, local ingredients into their work. So they never let the lack of European ingredients deter them, which I always found very like interesting from a magical perspective, because the one thing you hear a lot about magicians or people who want to practice magic online is they'll always say, oh, I can't get this X, Y, and Z. Well, yeah, you can. You can do whatever you want. You just have to you just have to sometimes adapt. And so I think that they were very masterful at adapting these very like Euro heavy text into a kind of working magic. Now, can you say it's like a village magic? Sure. But they were using higher order concepts, like deep concepts from like Europe and Goetia and Enochian magic, and they were using like the sixth and seventh book of Moses, like Nick showed, or the George Homan book, the Long Lost Psalm. So you were getting, or the Long Lost Friend, excuse me. So they were also getting this in Jamaica. that's what's really interesting too. So you have to think like this is spreading throughout all the Western world, and this is also spread like the Henry Selig's or Secret of the Psalms. Like I got into an argument with this. Like someone was like, "That's not Kabbalah." Yeah, that is. That's practical Kabbalah. Like the recitation of Psalms, and each Psalm is actually related to a sephira. So it's a really interesting kind of like you can sort of reappraise the history of magic, being like, yeah, this stuff was like very alive. It was very people were definitely aware of it. People were definitely practicing it. People definitely own the books because they sold tens of millions of copies. And that company still exists today. Actually, it's really interesting. They sell jewelry, religious and magical jewelry.
Oh, that's that. Is that the site, right? That I was,
Yes.
I was
Yes.
like, yo, I'm dying. I'm done. That is funny. I'm gonna pull that up in a second. Something I just wanted to add real quick there, Jen, is that even stuff with like him pulling from the Book of Moses 6 and 7, to me shows where his influence is. That's because that's used heavily within ceremonial magic, especially people that like I knew that were big into this is like hard to explain, and I can't remember the exact, I guess, style of magic that would be considered. I don't know if it would be theurgical, but people who not necessarily use the Goetia, but use the angels and worked with the angels and maybe slightly kind of use the Goetia here and there, would be into the books of Moses, the books of Solomon. You know, another thing too. I don't think most people realize that the Goetia is like what, like the fourth or fifth book of a series.
Mm-hmm.
Three books of angels prior to that demons, but we don't know about those.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's already a bunch of books that you're supposed to read about angels prior to even getting to that book, actually.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is all this style of art and symbolism. And I would even start saying a little bit of Enochian maybe influence with that style of stuff that to me, I would just think if he was into the Book of Moses 6 and 7, this guy was into ceremonial magic. He was.
Oh yeah, he definitely was. And to even answer what JJ said before about the American Catholic Church, like they were a black spiritual brotherhood, probably some kind of black Masonic offshoot. They were
Sure.
definitely related to the spiritualist movement of the time, which obviously included people from various magical societies as well as the Theosophy Society. So we're definitely talking about someone who was moving in those occult circles, particularly in Chicago at the turn of the century.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about the Theosophical Society. What kind of crossovers there? Because their big headquarters is in Chicago.
Yeah, so I actually was hoping that you would be on, JJ, specifically because of this. So it is interesting to think about that it just burned down in North Hollywood, like the Theosophical Library, and then
Yeah, the library. Yeah.
yeah, to now sort of like talk about this, like the headquarters. Well, in my opinion, I'd love to hear what JJ has to say about this, and Nick obviously as well. But I think that there's something really metaphysically interesting about Chicago and Art Deco architecture and how the city's sort of like has this reputation as like a war zone city and
Right.
as like a mafia city is like as I think you said it, JJ, like the dirtiest city in America. I think that is long
It's
held.
dirty, filthy.
Yeah. But it's sort of like an unofficial ruling capital too of many sort of machinations in American politics. So I don't know.
You're right on target there, Jen. Especially when a lot of folks don't realize relative to American politics, and potentially, in my opinion, at least, the cultism amongst these crew. You got Chicago's the epicenter of activity of the Obamas, Hillary Clinton's hometown, and other folks in that orbit. And I think Clinton, one thing to overlook there is the associations her family has with the Chicago mob. In fact, her mentor was the bookkeeper for the mob.
And I think that's no surprise because it's something that you and I have discussed many times. It's something that Nick has discussed on the show many times. You've obviously discussed it on your show, and you've discussed it together. Is that it is really interesting how the mafia is occult. Like they are occultists. Not every mafioso, every gangster, every low-level guy is necessarily an occultist.
No,
just like every high-ranking bishop is not like a magician. But there's enough that they can lead and direct people to like their greater goals. That's all it takes.
Sure.
You need like 10 in a society of like 1,000. All it takes is
no,
a
for
10.
Sure. And I say look no further than Hillary Clinton. She's steeped in occultism from all angles. Her family's all mobbed up in Chicago. Allegations that her father was actually the underboss to Capone and took over once Capone went to prison. These are some of the stories I've gotten from some law enforcement associates in and around Chicago. You know, former high-ranking captains in Chicago PD have told me that story. So, you know, I don't know. I put a little bit of weight to it, you know, because again, her known mentor, Saul Alinsky, was mobbed up. The Marxist fellow, he was mobbed up. He was a bookkeeper there for the mob. So it makes sense to me that Hugh Rodham, Hillary's father, would then be associated as well. But she writes about going to do voodoo stuff in Haiti on her honeymoon. She's been, you know, there's all sorts of occultism surrounding Hillary there. No different than the Obamas too.
You know, it's so obvious to me that, like, Nick was even saying this. I forgot if he said it pre-recording or right at the beginning, but he was talking about how voodoo could almost be, it's not a novel system, and he didn't say that, so I'm not putting words in his mouth, but there's an element to voodoo that it makes so much sense to I'm going to say it like in a specific way, but I don't mean it in a derogatory way, but a higher order occultist is going to instantly recognize very important, maybe secret things in voodoo right away, just from the iconography. If you know a little bit of the backstory, if you have some ceremonial or like deeper occult knowledge, you're just going to know. You're going to see like there's a red pillar, a blue pillar system, like there's all these syncretic saints that, you know, oh, okay, I can actually make this work. Like you can see there's a whole system there of like the magical reality.
That was even the thing, like, I was saying that pre-recording, and I think JJ even seemed interested by it, is that I said, just for myself, and again, I wasn't so much adhering or using their system, but I was kind of translating it into ceremonial magic. I would take a lot of, I guess you would say, I think it's hoodoo, right? Some people will say voodoo is the religion, hoodoo is the practice. I don't know if people, you know, if that's how you look at it, but
is that the delineation? I'm not familiar with the difference.
Yeah.
I would say that hoodoo's just the American version. Like, yes, there are different. You could make a distinction, like Nick is saying. Like, yeah, you could say that. That's totally true. But I think it's much more complicated than that. But
I think it's a real basic way of explaining it. I don't know enough, but I do think even myself, that's kind of a basic way to.
But certainly voodoo is like there is a liturgical element, you could say. Like you could say that like chaos magic is to Tolima what like hoodoo is to voodoo.
Yeah.
Drawing from, but not necessarily the same thing.
Sure.
But yeah, when I was into ceremonial magic a lot, just because of the use of so many oils and herbs, and I was into that just for making incense and certain things. That like if I wanted to make certain tinctures or like jars to just like sit and like I guess like charge it with something, kind of like almost an amulet or a talisman. I would actually kind of like use certain I guess hoodoo recipes.
Mm-hmm.
Because they would translate easy over for me with ceremonial magic, because like basically it's all like all the things in there are pretty much there to still symbolize a planet or an element, and you can translate that over into ceremonial magic easily once you start doing stuff like that. I mean, to be totally honest with you, even in 777 Crowley 777, I think I might even include possibly like even have a column for that. So that's like you can easily start seeing the associations once you look at it. Certain even gods, and I would start saying, hoodoo or voodoo, like Papa Legba, certain people, you can see who they would translate over into a different pantheon, and then you could understand. And it's just like, it's kind of like there's like a chart, really. If you really want to get into it as a ceremonial magician, you can start making charts and start seeing how you could start equating things. And hoodoo or voodoo to me was just very simple to equate over to ceremonial magic into something that I wanted to do, even though I wasn't doing a voodoo or hoodoo ritual. So long story short, I don't explain myself.
That was a great story, Nick. I totally agree, like 100%. Like I'm not necessarily like, I'm not a ceremonial magician. I'd never pretend to be. I'd never say I was, but I definitely played a lot with magic. Like it was definitely like a prime focus of my life for many years. So I would say that like yes, I have the parallel experience of like translating voodoo, which I never was, into sort of like the we'll call it a pseudo Catholic sort of sinister left hand path Catholicism frame that I was trying to like see if I could synthesize at that time. And so it made a lot of sense to draw from hoodoo, especially, or not hoodoo, excuse me, voodoo, because there's a huge West Indian population in Toronto. Super easy to go to a Botanica, get what you need. And the iconography made a lot of sense to me. Instantly I could see, okay, there's a relationship between this idea, this planet, this angel, this thing, this, and the colors were very clear. It's not convoluted at all. It's almost like you're looking at the same system, just like slightly modified to fit the existing culture. And I think Nick's also speaking to that experience. So I think that a chaos magician, kind of like reconstructionist, or a ceremonial magician can actually understand a lot of what's going on there just from having some basic knowledge on the occult.
In my opinion, if you're a ceremonial magician who even entertains herbs and oils, at some point you're going to start looking at hoodoo recipes because you're just going to get bored. That's all the same shit. It's a bunch of herbs and oils and crap.
So I'll say this, and maybe it'll be a little controversial, but that's okay. Is that I actually prefer a lot of the hoodoo recipes for like doing that kind of like maybe low magic or that like quick.
Oh
magic.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, I think it's superior in some ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And I think that it's more potent. And I also think that the jars, that's something that hoodoo gets really right, is like
that's what I was talking about, like jars, or they call it roots.
Yeah, the jars like souring or honey jars, I think those are like a great. I'm not telling people to do sour jars on people, don't do that, but I'm saying that it is like it's a good low magic tool if you want to learn something that works. And it's
a really good way to put a low magic tool. Very well said.
I mean, that's what it is. I'm not saying it in like a mean way, but like
no, not even in the mean way. I know exactly what you mean. High magic and low magic. That's very very easy. A lot of people who would normally use that would not be setting up an altar and doing banishing rituals just to entertain a bottle. You know what I'm saying?
Like, yeah, 100. No, Nick's totally right. And like because like you don't need to invoke a spirit for those. You don't need to like know any special. There's no like special magic. You follow the thing. You recite the psalm. You shake it on the appropriate planetary hour. Like that's it. So like that's a practical magic tool. Like, just like Nick said, like that you can use. It doesn't require anything.
Well, the problem is that that's how at least it's presented as.
Well, of course you can make it really like amazing, and you can like seal it with planetary metals and like.
No, yeah. But I'll put it this way: people who are actually really practitioners of that stuff will actually probably make a big deal out of it.
Oh yeah, 100%.
But it's easily sellable, as you don't have to do anything with this stuff except for just mix it and say blah 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 blah.
I mean, no, you're totally right. It's just like let's be honest. That like
I think that's kind of like the psyop within hoodoo.
Oh yeah, it is. It's definitely like the it goes with that new thought, that kind of manifestation thing. There is something true about that. Like
Grand Rising, you're manifesting today.
But there's also something kind of bullshit about that like whole thing. It's like, yeah, you do co-create your reality, but like maybe it's not like maybe that kind of like weird consciousness that they tell people, like that very Tiferatic kind of like I'm the savior of like the world's like thing. Like I don't know if that's that useful is what I'm saying. So yeah, I agree with that. Is like just because you can like maybe influence someone to give you a phone call, like that's not that that's
basic
deal.
Black magic right there.
Yeah,
it's not impressive. You're saying that's not very impressive?
No, not at all.
No.
You could just be a manipulative motherfucker and get something.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, like you can do the same thing with magic that you can do with words. If you can do that, then that's not that impressive.
You can text somebody hi and make them call you.
That's right.
Sure.
It's not that. I mean, come on. No, and the reason I'm even cracking up so much is because like it's kind of funny what you're saying, Jimmy, because I remember when I was very like active kind of within the community, there was a lot of silliness that kind of went around this type of stuff.
And I think
Looks
that's
like
part of it. I think that's part of why his whole reputation was as like a snake oil salesman or a con man, and why he even has that reputation for stealing the Magus, is because he did take all of these things into like these things that were in public domain and he put them in popular culture, and he was obviously making a ton of money doing it. Maybe he was like a mob. Like I think what JJ said actually goes along with like the story of him and what occultism in Chicago at that time was, which was a center of American occultism. Everybody, like, I'm not putting down New York. Nick's on the stream, so obviously it's a show. But
Oh, not in New York anymore.
I think Chicago. You could argue that there were two main capitals of occultism in America, at least at this exact moment. One of them would have definitely been Chicago. I would argue that that was probably true.
Yeah, I think it still is, right? I mean, you got there's a large theosophical center there. You got the Baha'i faith headquarters there.
That's
You got
interesting to me.
oh, they're a super interesting bunch, aren't they?
You know, it's like this. You see this a lot with theosophy, this kind of like offshoot religions that are kind of theosophical, but then they're kind of like their own thing. Like Alice Bailey, she was kind of like the perfect example of like an offshoot theosophist. Like they take an idea that is kind of like half baked to begin with, but there's something, yeah, there's something interesting there. Like, yeah, there's something interesting. Like I'm not a racialist or like an identitarian, so I don't really, that root race stuff, that doesn't really, I don't know. I think that's kind of weird and bullshit, but that's just me. You believe what you want. Um,
Sure.
but they take it and then they go to like this really weird extreme, and then all of theosophy then gets tainted by these like kind of really weird concepts. And like I think theosophy at its root was just really about like looking at the different systems and seeing if you could put it together into something interesting. Now, do I think they made some errors when they did that? Yeah. Do I think that they should have like worshipped that kid, like a 12-year-old little kid, as like the Kumara and like set up this whole like moonchild complex? That's what I'm calling it. Um, no, I don't think they should have done that, because I don't think Krishnamurti was the moonchild, and nor do I even think that it matters, frankly. And I think it was like a weird theosophy thing. And I think it goes along with what you say, JJ, about like alien cargo cults. It's like they don't need to do that. Just be normal. You can practice theosophy, but just like also be normal at the same time.
Well, that's a good point. I was wondering if these folks had any alien bend to their situation, because what you were describing earlier when I had stepped away, it sounded a lot, and I think Nick brought it up about Dwight York. Sounds a lot like a more science temple stuff, especially when you were covering, Jen, the term that they don't call themselves scientists, but they refer to it as science. It just and obviously more science has the
Science a lot, yeah.
Dwight York got a lot of his stuff from
Math.
more science.
Mathematics.
No, definitely. They were definitely, so when they're drawing on the same thing, and this is the interesting thing, is that you had a lot of Jamaican people moving to New York in the 1930s. Zora Neale Hurston, who was she was the whatever the FDR program, they supported her and gave her like a ton of money to go publish books on hoodoo, voodoo, and Obeah. So she went down to the Bahamas, down to Georgia, Florida, all the like these like hot spots, and also Jamaica. So she wrote like actually quite a good book on Jamaican Obeah. Now a lot of people don't like it because they're saying, oh, she's like not really interpreting it right, because you could see how much the system had degraded. So I think there's also something interesting with that, where it's like you can see how these sort of like ideas, they they start off really like maybe they're like very African, they're very like temple, they're very like music, drums, like they're doing like a whole ritual. But then when
Sure.
she's writing about it in like the 30s, it's turned into like a very like this lone magician on the mountainside in Jamaica, and he's like doing like the I forgot what it's called, the exercises of Loyola, Saint Loyola of Ignatius. Like they're doing these like really tough spiritual exercises. They're doing like crazy sort of fasting, and so that's really what it turns into. Is that it wasn't really like wasn't the same kind of magic that we're talking about with DeLaurence Company. So I think that also answers your question. Is like, were they alien religion worshippers? I think by this point you could say that their highest order thinking was that there were angels that they were invoking directly into themselves to then give gospel to the the dirty masses, basically. And so
Yeah.
the American Catholic Church, there's some discrepancy of whether it exists or doesn't exist anymore. Now it seems to exist in a fashion, in a sort of like a black charismatic West Coast context. So I think this also goes along with what you were saying about like Brother Panic, because we know that there was just like so much discrepancy and overlap between like the West Coast gangs and the East Coast gangs. And some, like, they were drawing from, like, one is clearly more Islamic, and one is clearly more drawing from this like drugstore hoodoo Jewish tradition, like the Kabbalah stuff. You can see that there's like a more Islamic oriented one with the numbers, because they use the Arabic numbers. So when they're saying like different things, like if I look at her, and even Nick looks at it, maybe Nick is because he's more experienced and a little older than me, he just knows, like, he can look at them and be like, okay, this is from Islamic magic. Whereas me, when I look at it, my only reference is like Tantra or Kabbalah. So I might not actually even know what they're talking about a lot of the time, and I don't. So there's like a clear delineation where I can see they're talking about Arabic numerals and like the Arabic sort of understanding, which is quite different. And that, or when they're talking about the Hebrew sort of wisdom or the Hebrew science behind the numbers, like I can tell which one they're talking about. I'm sorry.
That's interesting. So, what do you mean they don't? That no one knows if the American Catholic Church still exists? Did they,
So,
did,
so
did they
he
go
did.
defunct at some specific time, or is this another myth of another cult formerly existing, like the Process Church disbanded in 1970 style myth?
Okay, so this is really interesting because where did this church? They didn't sign their their confederation documents. I'm not using the right word. I apologize. They did not sign that original document in New Orleans, but their dissolution was supposedly in New Orleans. So when I read that, I instantly thought of you, JJ, because I was like,
Nice.
this is like Process Church, like 100%.
Yeah,
Like,
it's international waters down there in Louisiana. I'm telling you, they got those Napoleonic laws. For some reason, folks feel like they can. There's some sort of attraction with these cults. It seems to incorporate down there because there's a number of other cults that have done that there and around New Orleans.
you know, there's this idea on Canadian parapolitical Twitter, then I'm going to bring it back to New Orleans, but there's an idea on Canadian parapolitical Twitter that um, Canada was actually supposed to be incorporated into the Louisiana Purchase.
Oh,
So if you kind of understand our very specific, very, like, we'll call it lumberjack conspirator sort of ideas, there is no actual proper confederation documents because the British sort of said, oh, they're in these treaties, the numbered treaties, and then these wampum belts. So we don't actually have like a tangible set of confederation documents. They're kind of these different pieces of it exist all over. So the Louisiana Purchase would have been our confederation document, at least for the Canada that existed, French Canada, at that time. So it is
sure.
kind of interesting because now that Trump's saying that we're the 51st state, I'm just saying it would kind of be the manifest destiny of French Canada in
Yeah,
many ways to sort of return to the U.S. It's an interesting idea.
I like it. See,
But sorry, JJ,
it's
go ahead.
no, but it's gonna get wild from here. Whatever goes on, right?
I mean, I'm like, I think it's cool. I'm going with it. We're just riding with it right now, and
Right.
we're just like, it's an incredible time to be alive. It's exciting. It's kind of nerve wracking, but like, I don't really let it affect me. I'm like, yeah, there's, the conservative Canadian Twitter is so embarrassing. They just, like, it's
Okay.
like boomer tier, like Facebook, like they just don't really know what's going on. Then there's like this other group like me, they're like all these dissident people who are like, yeah, let's just merge with the US. Like, who cares about Canadian Twitter or pull up politics anymore? Let's just go with it. So I think that there's like this libertine element that you're kind of even speaking to, of like, what is international waters and why is it centered around this area with Napoleonic sort of admiralty law.
Yeah,
I
there's
think,
something to it. There's something to
yeah,
it.
and I think that there is something like, even to go back to like the French stuff. Like, we know even in the Caribbean, there's this huge division between like the French islands, the Spanish islands, and the English islands, and there's
Sure.
almost like a racism between them.
Right. Right.
So I think that it even speaks to like this kind of thing, like what are we watching play out? Like a lot of this is like old. It's like we've seen this already play out. And I think that's actually part of what the DeLaurence Company sort of like did is they were to spread a certain kind of European thinking of like more, or we're saying American, more of like maybe the American brand of occultism. That's what they were supposed to spread to the English speaking islands, because it is really interesting that in 1901, so the date of this company's founding, there was a bill passed in Jamaica's parliament called the Anti-Obeah legislation, which made it a crime to actually possess any book
Damn.
that was published by the DeLaurence Publishing Company. So
Wow.
it's really interesting that like the date coincides. So they're clearly what we could even be looking at, JJ. I'm just gonna go there, Nick, because you brought JJ on, so I'm just gonna go full conspiracy.
I like it.
I think that we're looking at like American occultists are trying to spread American occult ideas, like what their frame of the occult is, which is like in a curation of these books and like the Obeah Bible and all of these things. But I think even in the sort of naming of them, like the even calling it the Obeah Bible, they know they're going to speak to a West Indian audience with that, but they're also going to speak to like an American audience who's hungry for those West Indian ideas, because there is like a large part of the occult community who loves we'll call it exotic magic system. There just
Sure.
is. I'm like that too. I think everybody has like their thing where they're like, yeah, sometimes it's really interesting to look at what these other people are doing or this other thing. Or maybe that's like we would say in Buddhism, that's like your dharma. That's what like you see that, you see those crazy images, and that's what gives you understanding.
Yeah,
It's
I
like
mean, it makes a
that
lot of
sits
sense to me, especially when I'm looking at all this Egyptian iconography, because growing up Mormon, obviously that was something Joseph Smith incorporated into his system of ceremonial magic, the Mormon system there. And so I think that's one thing that would attract a lot of folks when the missionaries are going out. All this Egyptian iconography speaks to folks, at least on a subconscious level. Maybe that's just my perception of it, because growing up Mormon, I remember looking at, I have to carry my books every Sunday to church and whatever other days of the week I'm going there. But in one of the books, not just the Book of Mormon, there's a number of volumes that comprise your scriptures. I believe it was the Pearl of Great Price, and it's got like, I don't know, pages of Egyptian, nonsense going on in there, which I don't remember I'm not even sure if it tells you what it is, to be quite honest with you. I just remember as a kid, I'm like, well, this is cool. I'm just going to scroll through these pages for a while.
Okay, sorry, JJ. I just want to jump in. Nick, do you want to say anything about the image? Because there's something interesting. I think you see it too.
Oh no, I'm like laughing at just my opinion. Listen, just people listening and watching. Ever come across a website that has some shit like cleanse yourself and your environment and protect yourself and your loved ones and manifest love, success, and prosperity? They're selling you bullshit.
Is that the secret?
Yeah, it's a scam. So please, if anybody ever comes across a site that starts pitching you shit like that, just X out of it.
I do think it's interesting they're using a seal of Moses. So that key thing is like a symbol.
Oh, is it?
Yeah,
That one right there.
That's one of the seven seals. I don't remember which one it is because I don't have the memory. Like I know the Solomonic seals. Like if you ask me like which one does what, I could tell you. The seals of these ones I don't know from heart, but I have a general feel for some of them. But this is definitely one. And then I think that one thing that Nick was saying that's true is like, yeah, it's a scam, because like, what does that even mean? Like cleanse your space, protect your loved ones, invoke fortune. Like that could mean like 50 things to like 50 different people. That's like the most specific advice you could ever give. But I think that there's something interesting because it ties in with DeLaurence. He maybe ghost wrote some of the American New Thought books. So this is interesting because we know that there was some kind of competing CIA MI6 publishing, and people will be like, "Oh, those are just the same thing," but actually, this is like like JJ can tell you, this is the pre-war or the post-war kind of like the guys who were like company men who weren't necessarily like out to destroy the world, whatever that even was. I think they were actually like looking like we're just furthering American interests. So the idea was like we're going to put out like an American sort of new thought system that's going to counter this kind of like the MI6 is, and JJ and Nick have both discussed this extensively, is that they get very fixated on transgressive magic. I'm not saying the CIA didn't have many programs that they clearly were as well, but I think if we're looking at like the broader scope of Western magic, I think that MI6 has clearly gone down darker roads for much longer and more of them. I'm not justifying anything. I'm not saying anything is good. I think that, even from Kali Kola, from like Kali Tantra, I think it's very obvious that there were people learning the highest level of Kali Tantra during like the British rule of India, and I think that was also true for the Caribbean. And I think that's also true for what the DeLaurence Company was doing and why they got outlawed. Because you even see a difference. Like a lot of the French islands do not even know of the sixth and seventh book of Moses. It's a very uncommon book for certain linguistic groups. And you see this also with certain ones that are more popular in French and Spanish magic. You have like the Petit Albert. That's a much more popular French and Spanish grimoire than it is in English. In fact, it wasn't even, I think the Stephen Skinner was the first one to do like the major translation of that. It didn't happen until like the 2000s, if I remember correctly. That might be incorrect, but
Stephen Skinner. I haven't heard that name in a minute.
well,
I
there's
don't
all
know
these
that name.
OGs. There's all these. He's a major. I would say he's like. Would you say Nick? He's like a major
Yeah, he's known.
occultist.
Yeah, he's known. Yeah, he's got like his own. I think his own version of 777 as well. His own association as well. It's pretty deep.
And he did all these translations and kind of like he did a Seal of Solomon version, and his version is like if you ask people who work the keys, they will tell you like his version is the most complete. He sort of filled out some of the Hebrew. He fixed some of the way the sigils looked, and he also sort of retranslated it from the original German, I believe it was, instead of just translating it from like a French translation, which was the typical standard. So he actually went back and found like a much older version in German and was like, we're going to actually fix this for like an English speaking magician. So I would say he's quite well regarded as far as
Oh yeah, for sure.
and yeah.
Yeah, he's known in the ceremonial magic community for sure.
And he's still alive, or is this he's deceased?
Oh no, he's still alive. Yeah.
Is he? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I thought about trying to get him on the show, but I have no idea.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, it's funny. Somebody else that has they have a Thelemic podcast just had him on recently, and I was like, God damn it! How do I? I was trying to get them to like get me in touch with them, but they won't answer their DMs. So I'll try.
Yeah, you'll have that. So, Jen, I like the idea of the exporting the Western magic to these island nations. And it's interesting, especially when you're talking spook activity relative to Chicago. That Chicago is the epicenter, still is in some part, but especially in years past, before the age of the interwebs, Chicago was the epicenter of all publishing activity in America. So basically, everything that's getting published, or actually printed, is getting printed out of Chicago. I mean, you'll have your New York papers and stuff like that, but any kind of periodicals, a lot of syndicated newspapers and stuff get printed out of Chicago. All the pornography industry. Playboy Mansion may have been in Los Angeles, but the Playboy Hustlers getting printed out of Chicago. So very, very, that's a long standing thing though, for Chicago being the epicenter of all these books and periodicals and whatnot. So that's that's what spooks they got to get involved in those activities. Anyone who thinks that the CIA hasn't been deeply involved in the printing and publication in America's, they're deeply mistaken. It's an industry that the long before the interwebs, they're getting involved in the dissemination of information.
I mean, that's the most magical thing you can really do. I mean, I spoke about this with Nick on his episode, is that like we were talking about something that we actually speak on relatively often, is like Crowley, and how he kind of would have magical experiences or like retell certain stories in a specific way or at a specific moment. So he kind of re-narrates what's going on. But in the way that he's doing that, that's a magical act. Like, he's doing a magical ritual if you believe it. Like, if you take that, even if you don't believe it, you can say it's total bullshit. But if you remember that story, that's in a way a magical act, because he's implanting, I'm copying Nick like verbatim here. He's like implanting an idea in your mind that you will carry through space and time.
Especially if you never knew of it before. He just gave you an option or an idea you never had before. Ooh, that can be powerful if you remember it. Jen, there was something I was going to ask. Oh, do you think there's anything specific? Because there was some people asking in the chat. Well, the key you did say you thought was that's from the Book of Moses, right? You said one of those.
Oh yeah, it's definitely from the Book of Moses. I could actually even figure out which one very easily. I just have to look at my copy.
And then the stuff in the background. Do you think any of that hieroglyphics or these whatever engravings? Do you think any of them are specific for something?
I'm sure
I was wondering the same.
Yeah,
well,
right.
I mean, even the color, like the black and the yellow, it's very, like, I would say it's like very Jinn of the sun. Not my name, but like a Jinn with a D. It's very Jinn of the sun, but you could also say it's
Solar.
very Ka. Yeah, there's something that's solar, but also fixed in place, like something that's really holding it there, crystallized. You could even say. I think that the background is really interesting, just because like the Egyptian stuff doesn't, for whatever reason, it has no effect on me. I never remember it. I've listened to like Nick and Robbie discuss it a million times, literally the same episodes 10 or 15 times. I could not tell you the stories over again.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, they just don't stay with me. So I don't know them, but I'm sure that they are metaphysically significant. And I also wanted to shout out Chad. He did ask like the use of herbs in science or Obea. So they do have a really interesting doctrine of signature system, is what they would call it. Doctrine of signatures is both a medical and, well, it's not considered medical now, but it, for most of medical history, it was considered a medical thing. It's like the sort of nature of the plants would actually correspond to like an organ, a planet, metal, and then you would be able to also test the plant, and then you could find like trace elements. Like every plant has trace elements. Like nettle is very high in iron, so nettle is always considered a martial plant because it causes urticaria, which is like a reddening. It's very
I've
irritating.
used metal for Mars before. Yeah.
It's a very martial. It has the nature of Mars. So that would be its doctrine of signatures. It would be like an outward expression of what it is, metaphysically. It's basically what it is. So they would just, like Nick was saying, like they can, a true magician can look at the herbs that they're using and sort of. I'm not saying it's like easy. I'm saying that there's a way that you can look at herbs and kind of recognize their nature and be like, yeah, this actually makes sense. You can relate this to this planet, this thing to this scent to this. So then you can use their system. So Jamaica actually is one of the most biodiverse places in the Western Hemisphere, if not the most. I think it's actually Dominica. So not the Dominican Republic, Dominica. So Dominica is its own teeny little English speaking island where they also practice Obea, very interestingly, and they also grow a lot of chocolate. So also very interesting. So also it's important to note that when we're talking about the islands, and our guest brought their next guest brought this up the last time, Abdutari and Matt, is that he said, well, Trinidad's had this ruler, this ruler, this ruler, like all these European countries. That's the same for every single one of the islands. So like, to go back to something JJ was saying, like spook activity and publishing, yeah, you're probably going to have different waves of published materials coming from the different factional magicians, if you want to call them that. There would be
Sure.
different kinds of things popular at different times, depending on who is the governor of the island.
That makes sense. Yeah. Especially, I mean, that's kind of how those islands are still run today, right? Like Haiti's kind of the same way, right? Like their dictator's kind of some sort of magical wizard, right?
So this is really interesting. It's always fascinated me. It's fascinated me because Voodoo is very fascinating as a religion. It just is. I know a lot of people have very negative feelings. I'm not saying it's necessarily positive or negative. I probably think it's positive or negative largely because I think you have to look at a religion by how it bears fruit and the place that it's from. I don't know if it necessarily um, bore the best fruit, but I think as a system though it's very interesting. So they've always had a magical system, a fraternal order magical system in Haiti since liberation. And that even brings it all the way around to Duddy Bookman. So Duddy Bookman was definitely drawing from these English occult ideas, but he was bringing them into Haiti. He was bringing them into that French hellfire, libertine, and plus the Africanized system. So that's what's really interesting is right in the like earliest days of the Haitian Republic, you have this synthesis, this kind of merger of different magical systems. And then after the supposed liberation of Haiti, they actually had no French born priests for 200 years. So
Right,
Haiti
right,
trained all its own priests in a
right.
Masonic system, specifically Masonic. And even the name of the school was called
Oh.
like École Masonique or something like that.
So is voodoo and masonry kind of mashed together? Was that what we're talking?
Yeah. In Haiti, I would absolutely argue that the both of them are intermingled to a high degree. Now, are they like is it like Black Lodge masonry? Okay, sure. Like I wouldn't be able to tell you like what the specificity of it, but is it mixed in? Yeah. It can be mixed in just because people recognize like red and blue and white and they kind of know that that's really magical, so they'll like borrow those kind of like external, we'll say, Kabbalistic ideas. Like Nick was even saying this, like how people will hang the pentacles or the sigils in like the Dutch Pennsylvania, but they don't
Hmm.
necessarily know it's like super magical. But yeah, you could just borrow the idea because you heard someone else say it's really magical.
More of a folk tradition at that point, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
exactly. And I think
Mhm.
that's one of the problems with voodoo is because it's spun out into so many different houses,
Sure.
and that's what they call them. So every house sort of gets its own rules, and they can sort of rewrite them from scratch almost, but they have to follow certain liturgical guidelines. But then they have like different families, is what they call them, of
Sure.
spirits or loi, or which can also be translated as the French for law. I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't disagree with that, but it's just one sort of interpretation of the name. But they can, if they work with certain spirits, their whole purpose is to be very unconventional or transgressive. So I think this actually even speaks to like the Scientology process difference. Like there's houses that clearly focus really on what we call white magic, like healing, protection, like road opening is a big one, Abre Camino. But then there's like ones that specifically focus on like black magic. We're gonna like be the dominating force, and then I speak that is like to your question, JJ, is about the sorcerer king. So they've always had a sorcerer king. It's inescapable in Haiti to be in any position of power, influence, financial or political, and not have association with you could say a faction of these houses, of these like hoodoo bokors or hoguns.
Sure. No, that makes a lot of sense, and especially with your comparison to the Scientology and process stuff. The different the houses as you put them. The Yeah, that's interesting. The Yeah, Haiti's a weird place. It's yeah, I see what you're saying. It's kind of inescapable. They have a system of politics. Sounds like Freemasonry as well, and religion that's kind of mashed together as one figurehead.
And that's the problem with it, is like it becomes tribal at a certain point. Like once the system degrades to like a level, it just becomes street gangs. Like yeah, it's clearly Masonic, this like system of houses that are allegiant to one red or blue faction. They even wear those colors like for
Oh,
their
really?
houses. They're
Bloods
called
in the Crips,
drapeau.
huh?
Yeah, absolutely. They call them drapeau, and they will wear them in their back pocket like very Bloods and Crips, or they'll wear them as a bandana. So I mean, yeah, they're not escaping. Like they're it's very Masonic. Like it's like it's deep in their gangs and their kind of ruling politics. Um, I
Do
think
they
it's
have their own Crip
interesting.
walk?
before.
I
The
do
Haitian
think
Crip Walk.
I do think it's interesting to reference Jamaica, though, because obviously when I did my episode, it was on Edward Siaga, who was sort of like, he was Hapaborean. I often joke that I'm Hapaborean, but he was actually Hapaborean. He was like mixed he was mixed of everything. So he also he wrote some of the first published books on Obeah or science. And so he kind of broke a long-standing taboo, and it was also illegal to study those things. So how did he get funding to study those things and then go on to be the prime minister? Very interesting. But and he was clearly involved with certain factions of drug gangs. His faction was blamed for the bombings of many airports, certain assassinations, and he was considered to be one of the best prime ministers Jamaica ever had. So yeah, he's a really interesting figure, JJ. He would be worth a deep dive, honestly.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check him out. He sounds like a real
And
stand-up guy. I've only been to Jamaica once. It's an interesting place.
it's an interesting place, and but like all of the Caribbean seems to have this underlying thing of the cartels or the drug gangs, or maybe they're
Oh
not even
yeah,
cartels. They're just like street level drug gangs who say you can't smuggle through my territory.
sure.
That seems to be a big thing in the islands. Like the territories are seem to be very important to them, like just maintaining sort of like these what we would maybe look at as tribal lines or like ethnic lines or religious or linguistic lines. They tend to see as like you just must maintain that. So ancestrally, generally, yeah, the drug pipeline from it's usually from Trinidad all the way up into the Bahamas was the traditional sort of like, especially in the 70s and the 80s. But he was a really interesting prime minister because he wrote on Obeah, but he also was known as like quite a ferocious Obeah practitioner himself. So I just wonder if it's like maybe you look at every prime minister or president of the islands and maybe you would find it in their background like without question. I don't know if
Sure.
that's true, but I just think it would be an interesting proposition.
It sounds like a common trend in amongst the Caribbean there. Yeah, it's interesting that there's no shortage of drugs on those islands at all. I
That's
mean,
right.
they got to get there somehow. So something. I mean, it's like it's one of these open secrets. Are like because you see guys with machine guns walking around everywhere, but like, so you think there's some level of security going on. You know, I mean, it's just these are just fiefdoms. They're operating big drug trafficking fiefdoms. Because I remember going to Jamaica. I had a fellow. I was walking around town. This dude was following me around for like an hour trying to sell me coke. I'm like, look, dude, I didn't want coke an hour ago. I don't want coke now. You know what I mean? Go find somebody else to sell your coke to.
Yo, I will say, my experience, I've been to Jamaica twice. Both times, I've never been so fucking harassed for drugs before.
Right? That's what I'm saying.
Oh, shit. Yo, Lee, can I just go on vacation?
Yeah, right.
Alone. Yo, that shit was annoying. Even at the resort that I was at.
Sure.
I was like, oh, the lifeguard's here to actually save someone's life, or are they here to sell drugs? I was like, I was getting asked by like fucking almost everybody that worked at the place too.
Yeah.
He says, no, I don't want to buy your garbage. I brought my own. Thanks. I brought my own vape, but I'm good. Thanks.
That's definitely my experience there.
Yeah. I'll stick with that and the endless alcohol. That's it.
Yeah.
Even the idea of alcohol, that even has a very magical origin story, especially if we're looking at Jamaican rum, because sugar rum is one of, like, if we're looking at Tantra, and there is a large Indian population, as we discussed in the last episode. There's a large Indian population, so the idea of using alcohol or what it would be ritually transmuted into, which is Quran, is like that is the tantric procedure. It's like the transmutation between alcohol into spirit. So it's making it ritually palpable for the spirits or the deity. Really, it's for the higher deity. But that has always had a very magical association. Obviously, people are very familiar with Florida water and what's the other one, Nick? I'm forgetting. I apologize. There's the two that are very famous, but there's actually an Obeah water, which is made from. It's not water. It's
You talking about Florida water?
Yeah, Florida water is one of them, and then there's another one that's like a Colonial. I don't know. Like
I actually made one of those things. I can't remember the name of it. It's like this mixture of stuff, and you make this like cleansing water.
So that's what Obea water is. It is like it's using the Jamaican overproof rum, so it has to be over 80%. So you can see, like in the traditional Jamaican rum making, it was like usually they would always brew above 80%, if not over 100. So it has to be a high proof, but then they would stick like John roots, they would stick Angelica, bay leaf, and it would be like, it's like a little different. It's like a little more a drugstore, you could say, or a little more. They would also put like leaves and things from the bush, is what they would call it. But it definitely had like, there would be both drugstore and like forest elements. So that's actually still famous in Jamaica, like Obea water. It doesn't smell anything like Florida water. So if people go to Jamaica, that's an interesting thing to try and look for at a candle store.
Interesting. Now, what was I know with this case, unless it was just a broad thing, didn't you say, well, with this company, didn't you say that it ties kind of in like to a true crime thing, or did you mention this already?
I think it's interesting because he was involved in various fraud cases, and he beat all of them, but he didn't. His reputation actually did suffer. He's often frequently called a con man, and then he also claimed to have ghost written several influential New Thought books. So exactly like we were talking about, like how there's this long-standing relationship between spiritualism, hoodoo, the new church movement, which would include the American Catholic Church. And so he was a big influence privately behind the scenes in New Thought, which is basically, if you will it, it will come. So he supposedly ghost wrote one of the more popular New Thought books at the time. I'm forgetting the name. I apologize. I'll look it up for the next time. But yeah, so he definitely was connected, I think, as JJ would agree with. He seemed to have ability to maneuver around high powered, and sometimes, obviously in the sense of Jamaica, it was illegal to own his book. So how was he getting it through customs? How was he able to deliver into like remote farmlands in Jamaica? Like it's kind of interesting.
What you're saying is he had that Jeffrey Epstein riz. He's skirting some federal charges every decade or so. Largest Ponzi scheme in American history at the time. Epstein walks. You know what I mean? He walks again on some of the big child deadly charges in Florida history. Walks again, basically. Spends 13 months in a wing of the jail that he built himself, and slept there on the weekends. Just checked in. So yeah, this guy definitely has that kind of impression. He's just skirting charges like without issue, especially if it's so outlawed. It makes you wonder, right?
Well, it's also interesting because Obea was also outlawed, and this is what I was referring to, Nick, is because it was outlawed because it was whether it was true or not true, they blamed it on the killing of many slave owners and like ex-slave owners. So like their descendants would often get poisoned or turned blue, or sometimes their heads chopped off. That was one time. And so yeah, they had like all these crazy things happen, and they would say, oh, it's because the slaves practiced, or they weren't slaves at this point. And actually in Jamaica, they were liberated quite early on. They would practice Obea. So it would often got blamed for any time there was civil unrest. So that was also another reason, even though I said it was kind of like a weird, that coincidence that DeLaurence Company founded in that same year as the bill passed. I think it was also because they often blamed this like higher order thinking. Because that's what he said he sold. That's why they even called themselves scientists instead of sorcerers, because they thought this is a higher order thinking. This is like true magi shit.
Oh, well, they're selling you 10-karat gold rings. I mean, come on, it's just legit.
There's no doubt in my mind that L. Ron Hubbard was fully familiar with this entire system in which to adapt his science and tech of Scientology.
I mean,
it's kind of a mail order system in and of itself. Yeah, you can go into the orgs, but you're really not mandated to for a lot of the aspects of the religion. A lot of it is just mail order shit.
I mean, I also think this, JJ. So it's so interesting that you bring it up, because he does. I don't like his stuff. I think his stuff is like dumb. I don't want to believe. I'm not a Scientologist. I'll never be a Scientologist. I don't really like him, but whatever. If it works for people, that's totally fine. But he clearly was very tuned into this American occultism as it historically was and how it was in his contemporary time. Because he seems to be, I'm not saying he's a master synthesist. I don't think anyone would ever compliment him so much as that. But I do think that he was able to bring it into something interesting. Like he was like, okay, I'm gonna like incorporate this little piece of thing and this little thing, and then it also was like, well, he thought of himself as very cutting edge, but then you
Oh,
could also
sure.
think of it like think it wasn't that he was cutting edge, it's that the agencies were like actually sending out the material right around the time that he, to that sort of bolstered his case. So it was cutting edge in a way because it was manufactured.
Makes sense. I mean, he definitely thought very highly of himself, so he thought he was cutting edge. Absolutely.
Yeah, he definitely thought he was cutting edge.
Yeah.
Something I wanted to. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Jin?
We didn't really talk about Secrets of the Psalms, but that's okay. Did you want me to discuss more of 6th and 7th book, or we're good for this
It's
one?
up to you. No, it's up to you. What do you think fits so far?
I think it was good. I think it gave everyone a taste. Like those are the main 3 books. They're a very specific part of a more Jewish Kabbalistic magic. They're not as Islamic coded as maybe some of the other grimoires that were also popular at the time. And Jamaica actually did have a specific contingent of Islamic kind of Obeah men from Mali. So they were one of the islands that got people from Mali, which is relatively rare. So they did have initially a tradition of making leather and metal charms with surahs, which are the Islamic version of psalms. Basically, they're each one is assigned a specific metaphysical property. So you write it and then roll it up and then put it into a little like a bullet case or a container or metallic, and then you tie it to leather. So but that actually died out. So I don't know how influential. I've only seen it in archaeology, like journals, like discussions of it. So I don't really know how much that preserved. But it is an interesting idea that you could say probably percolated through at least how they make charms.
Oh, one thing I wanted to mention before we wrap up, which is kind of why I asked Jin. Something you had mentioned before, JJ. I think you might have seemed surprised by it when I think mentioned. I think Masonic Masons kind of maybe being influenced by certain stuff. My opinion, them and a lot of other secret societies and occultists were influenced by like Native American and a lot of like indigenous type like stuff. In my opinion, I do think you will see a crossover of occult symbolism from the Native Americans even into ceremonial magic.
Really?
Yeah. It's kind of surprising because you start wondering like, well, which one came first? Like,
Right.
because
they had their own systems. Some of these native tribes had their own kind of Freemasonic systems, right?
Yes, they did. Kind of. Yeah. They would have their own systems.
Well, I recall there's a guy. There's a guy. What is that?
What do you think a tribe is?
No, but I mean, like they had their own, like within the tribe, they had like their they had their own like Freemasonic system within the tribe. Like,
but I'm saying if you look at the way a tribe is, I mean, it's very set up, very orderly, just like
very compartmentalized, right. Yeah, because there was a guy out of New York, a Society of Cincinnati member. He was half native. I want to say of the Anianta. I think Anianta, one of those native tribes there in central New York around the Finger Lakes. His mother, I think, was native. His father was, I think, a Dutchman there. Anyhow, he was a chief of that tribe. That's as later on in his life, but he was never allowed to be involved in the tribe's Freemason. He described it as like a Freemason. He was a Freemason as well. But he described it, the internal Freemasonry society to the native tribe, as being exclusively native. If you had anything other than native blood, you weren't allowed into their Freemasonry. It was very weird. I mean, they didn't call it Freemasonry, but it was a very Freemasonic system, the way this guy described. he was comparing it to his known Freemasonry, Scottish Rite Freemasonry. So it's weird. I didn't realize though that a lot of that stuff was found in ceremonial magic as well too. Huh?
Oh, for sure, I think so. I mean, what's really interesting, even with we've had Thrash on. He was in the chat before. I don't know if he's still listening. We've had him on cover Native American stuff. I highly suggest people to go back and check that out. It's an older one, very informative with Native American and symbolism. If you even start looking at like some of the tribes that he covered, and like he kind of goes over like how like there's certain people there doing certain things, and they have certain roles. It's almost very set up as if, and they seemed very focused on people having a magical experience, or kind of, or something very much like that, like even
Sure.
almost like a shamanistic experience. So even in myself, those tribes almost seem like they are set up to help bring individuals to have an actual magical experience. Because you're having people there that have gone through this before, they're doing all this ritual work, they're trying to help other people have their own experience. To me, I really honestly think they're very much like a secret order in their own self.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going by ancestry.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at the way some of them are, it's very much, and I could see maybe that's why they wanted to wipe them out.
Yeah. I think that Nick just hit it. Like, that's the whole thing. It was original Freemasons versus maybe upstarts. And that actually could be an underlying secret basis, you could say, for a lot of conflicts. Because the meta Weewins and JJ and I have discussed this a little bit before, but the secret, that's what we would call it in Cree, because I live in Canada, most Indigenous people here are Cree, so we all know some words. So Metaweewin is the word for medicine society. It's exactly what JJ is saying. It's like this secret lodge within the tribe. So you could say the tribe is like the inner religion already, because there are so many high barriers to entry into a tribe, right? But then the medicine society is like the ultimate barrier. And I'm so glad you brought up the Thrash episodes, because I was actually going to say that too, Nick, is that check those out, and Thrash was really great. So
those are actually very eye-opening to me, how much of occultism was in that and how much there was overplayed in stuff that I've seen. The symbolism and the colors used is just ridiculous. Wow. Yeah, that put me down like a rabbit hole after he came on for a little bit. I was just like, damn, this is some interesting shit here. Yeah, like you'll even see there's books. I think Denning and Phillips or something like that. I could be wrong. People that have these books that have like this certain 8-pointed star, but it's like very weirdly done. And it's like, yo, that's like the same thing that I saw in something Thrash showed on the show. Like the same symbol from some tribe that I think was on the medicine wheel. These occultists are throwing up on the front of their magical book.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was like, what the fuck? Obviously, there's crossover here.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly implies some sort of similar origin, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the Navajo use the swastika. I know Thrash and Nick covered this, and JJ and I have discussed this, and just like there's so much overlap. I mean, the ideas of clockwise and counterclockwise medicine, like sorcery and white magic, and like these like secret societies battling it out, and these like this richer cosmology than just is like presented as native cosmology. There's like a whole secret cosmology even beneath that, and what's really going on in the nature of reality, and like that some tribes like the Mohawks, and then Jefferson wrote very fondly about them, and they're kind of like they had like a pre-democratic system or a pre-republican system, depending on how you view it. And so he was very inspired by them, and even in Canada, they hold one of our Confederation documents as one of their treaties. So you can see, and their commercial success, I think, tribally building a casino and all of that, but I think you can see that they clearly belong to some kind of system that was able to, propel them to greater heights of success financially, at least. And so, but to bring it back to DeLaurence, just for before Nick closes us out, it goes along perfectly with this, because he was actually credited with this popularization of the Indian hoodoo saint. So he brought the idea of the Indian spirit guide into popular consciousness by rebranding the long lost friend into powwow. So he added that language later on. So because he was also interested in this idea of Indian spirit guides, which if you've practiced American magic in any sort of like capacity, like a Afrosyncretic magic or drugstore magic, or just like read any or a spiritualist book or a lot of theosophical texts that are specifically American, they always talk about like Indian spirit guides. There are specific ones. Father Blackhawk is by far the most popular, and he, especially in America, obviously, like the South America and Central America, they're very popular as well, but they have different names for them. But the one that's really popular in America is Father Blackhawk, who comes from Wisconsin. And there's actually a great book on this by Jason Barry. And so he talks a lot about something you'd find interesting, JJ, is the Mississippian snake cults. And so how there was like a snake cult among both tribal and white Scottish, like French Scottish settlers in the turn of the century around some like Mississippian area of a river.
Sure. Well, yeah, a lot of snake mounts to that region.
So I think that there is, like, this speaks to Nick's greater point. Like, there is a lot. I think this is a very understudied subject. I think there's a lot of like Native Americana in occultism. I think that there are certain Native people, largely mixed blood, simply because that's sort of how it works, that have like ability to use Native symbology to also understand more, we could call it quote unquote Western metaphysical ideas as well. But I think it takes a little more acumen, because I think those symbols are less accessible, whereas we, like, people have hacked magic, kind of, in a way, you could say. Like, you just have to put in the work, but a lot of people could do it. Whereas, like, the Native stuff is like, there's so many high barriers to entry. It's like, it'd be difficult to like pull it 100% and tell it, explain what it is.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Jim. I think we'll wrap it up. Again, for people like you even mentioned before, Jen, and I brought it up before as well, for people who have not heard it, even for the people listening and don't watch the video when you're catching this and it drops on audio, go back and check out the Native American series with Thrash. It's very, very, very interesting. I was very surprised by a lot of it, to tell you the truth. And yeah, Jin, the ninja, please let everybody know where they can find your stuff again one more time. So.
Sure. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, JJ, so much. Appreciate this. I know I kind of brought you on my I'm sort of infamously meandering, and so I'm glad that you let me meander. So thank you both, and I love being a guest as well as a reject. And so you can find me on this show. You can find me on my show, which is Threshold Saints, and you can, I'm around, so you can follow me on Twitter, Wukong Reborn, or IG Threshold Saints. There's also a show account, Threshold Saints, on Twitter. So if you don't want the nonsense, you can just follow the show, and that's it.
Thank you very much, and his links will be on the bottom as well. And JJ Vance, please let everybody know where they can find your amazing stuff.
No, I appreciate the invite, Nick. And Jen, as soon as Nick said you I didn't know anything about the subject, so learned a lot today. And as soon as Nick said you were invited me on, you were the other guest, I'm like, yeah, of course, I'll come join the fellow cult reject here.
I figured that would sweeten the pot when I asked him on such a short notice. I was like, Jen's coming on.
Yeah, I was like, oh, Jen, for sure, I'll definitely join you. Yeah, no, I always learn a lot whenever we discuss things, Jen. So today was no different. In fact, and as you're closing things out with the Indian spiritual guide, the only thing I could picture was Wayne's World 2, where Wayne's has an Indian spirit guide directing him to Jim Morrison in the afterlife to put on a rock concert.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, thank you, JJ, also for that compliment. And let me just say that I did re-listen to that show that I did, that JJ generously invited me on to do with him and Nick on Big Trouble in Little China. And it was actually, I actually was proud of myself. I was like, oh, I actually did a good podcast. I can actually do it. So,
no, that was an awesome show. We'll have to come back on again. We'll have to do some more esoteric and occult film reviews. That was good stuff. You got a lot of good reviews there, but. Yeah, I always enjoy the conversation, gents. I appreciate the invite there, Nick. And it sounds like this guy DeLaurence is to blame for all these with these spirit guys, is to blame for all these patchouli julies. I like to call them on Instagram, talking about their spirit guides. You know what I mean? Sounds like he's one of the epicenters of these the new thought or new age spirit guide activity, huh?
They're manifesting with their root jar. Yeah.
Right. I have a spirit guide, and you will appreciate this one, Jen. The guy I like to joke is my spirit animal is former Toronto Mayor Rob Ford, the guy that just would smoke crack out in public and refused to resign. I mean, the dude was a gangster, so that's like the joke. He's my spirit animal. I guess I have Lawrence to thank for these jokes. But no, it's a great conversation. Operation GCD live every Wednesday, and Fridays live every Friday with the Occult Rejects. So definitely looking forward to anytime we'll have to congregate here again sometime on these subjects for sure. But yeah, I always enjoy the conversation.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. And definitely check out the Fridays. We already got like the next few weeks kind of booked already, so we already know it's going to be some pretty decent shows, which it was going to be anyway.
Oh yeah,
regardless.
Good guess.
Yeah, definitely keep an eye out. Should be good, fun, and we'll both be back on together. It was a couple of weeks that he was off and then I was off, and we'll be back next week or this week, I mean. So yeah, definitely check it out. And again, thank you, Jen, for coming on, sir. That was truly interesting stuff, and never heard of this any of this stuff before, so I appreciate it. Yeah, it was totally new to me. Yeah, and everybody in the chat, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I saw a lot of the usual people and some new people. That's what's up. Great stuff. And I see some people over on JJ's channel chiming in as well. That's what's up. I appreciate it, you guys. And yeah, and until the next one, everybody be well. Later.